Welcome back everybody to the Costing and Pricing Learning Program. My name is David Gilchrist and this is webinar 16. In this webinar we're going to look at costing practice, but we're going to really focus on costing tools and have a little bit of a discussion around what kind of tools might be useful to your organisation, and perhaps more importantly how to arrive at selecting the right tool. Before we do that, just a little reminder, we do have copyright over this material, although the material can be used by anyone at all in relation to building capacity in disability services costing and pricing. So please make sure that you're familiar with the copyright arrangements. In terms of navigation, of course, the previous webinar, webinar 15 rather, was the NDIS pricing model. The next webinar, webinar 17, looks at understanding service volume. So we're looking at costing tools, a practical view this time round. Just a little reminder too that the study guide and other materials on the Costing and Pricing Learning Program website also help you to understand some of these things and should be looked at by everyone who's looking at this particular webinar. Let's have a look at the learning objectives for today's webinar. Obviously, costing and pricing has been a challenge for many within the disability sector. Incidentally, it's a challenge for many across government and the not-for-profit sector as well as the commercial sector, so there's nothing new in that. However, one of the things that is difficult about costing and pricing for those organisations that might be new to it, that might not have had to cost and price before, is how we select the kinds of IT tools that we need to support the process. This webinar is really intended for finance staff and finance decision makers who are charged with undertaking the implementation of a costing process. However, it considers the practical issues associated with costing and pricing models and establishes a set of criteria which can be used to assess the appropriateness of a particular costing and pricing tool to your organisation's needs. We cannot be very specific because we only have 20 minutes in a webinar. However, as I mentioned before, go back to the study guide and the other materials to give some consideration to what kinds of costing and pricing tools you might need to use. Just as a little reminder before we get into the main part of today's webinar, of course costing and pricing is very much focused on us as disability service providing organisations, highlighting or developing a target price, a price that we think we require in order to ensure sustainability in the short, medium and longer term of our organisations. Of course we look to compare this with what we call the achieved price. And the achieved price is the price actually provided by the funder. A good example of this is, of course, the price offered by the NDIA for services rendered under the NDIS arrangements. The difference between the target price and the achieved price becomes what we term the target price gap. And that's the difference that allows us to understand what our financial sustainability issues are and allows us also to give some consideration to both try to increase our funding but also try to ensure we're as efficient as we can be to close that target price gap. Any costing and pricing tool, of course, should help us to achieve this outcome. That's the essence of the costing and pricing tool. What are their issues? Well, there are a number of issues around costing and pricing tools because there's a number of costing and pricing tools out there. There are specifically written costing and pricing tools that you can buy off the shelf, as they say, or there are also other finance tools that can be used partly for costing and pricing and perhaps partly for other financial needs. There are also many supporting tools and software suites that may be of value. So those supporting tools might be things like MS Excel, Microsoft Excel, which is commonly used by accountants and others in both developing budgets, reporting financial information, but also costing and pricing itself. Perhaps you need to think about whether or not you should buy an off-the-shelf item, whether you should look at some of the costing and pricing tools that have been published since the development of the NDIS, and there are many of those tools around the country, or whether you could think about creating your own tool, either in MS Excel or some other platform, in order to be ensure that you have a costing and pricing arrangement or tool that is specific to your organisation's needs. The resources section of the Costing and Pricing Learning Program currently has a number of tools available. So do look at that website when you're considering what kind of costing and pricing tools you might need for your organisation. further costing and pricing tools will be added as they're gathered. So revisit that site too if you're in the process of making a decision around a costing and pricing tool. Of course, it's all at cplp.nds.org.au/tools. I guess the first question that comes to mind in all of this is why worry about this? Why put a lot of energy into selecting the tool when in fact you need to, of course, put most of your energy and your considered work into the costing and pricing process itself? But I think there's a really important issue for organisations to understand, and that is the selection of the tool for costing and pricing can have a significant impact both on the costing and pricing outcome, but also on the resources, the cost, the time, the complexity and other things that might go into the costing and pricing process caused by the tool. In other words, costing and pricing is a cost to the organisation. You need to cost and price accurately enough to ensure you understand your target price and the target price gap, as I mentioned before, but you need to also take into account the cost-benefit consideration. And the tool that you select will help you either be very efficient in your costing and pricing and perhaps cost at a higher level, so less detail, or it might allow you to cost and price at a very detailed level. But of course, the more detailed level you cost and price at, the more cost taken up in actually undertaking this exercise. And that cost is taken up both in terms of money. So if you buy a suite for costing and pricing, obviously you need to pay for that. In terms of money for consultants and other people to assist you in the costing and pricing process, and of course also in staff time, where staff are taking up undertaking costing and pricing and not doing other things that you might otherwise prioritise for them. Therefore, that cost-benefit analysis or consideration is extremely important. And when you're thinking about the costing and pricing tool, I think you really need to think about what level of costing complexity you want to achieve, how minute you want to cost to the organisation, and what kind of cost and benefit comes out of that particular process. All of these questions, of course, help you to be efficient in your tool selection, and selecting a tool is really important in the context of your understanding of what you need in your organisation. Therefore, in terms of first steps, I think there's a number of things that organisations need to ask themselves. For instance, how comfortable is your organisation in costing and pricing itself? In other words, do you have the skills and capacity, the experience to be able to select a costing and pricing tool, or do you need some support to do that? If you've never costed and priced before, then it might be that you lose considerable time and resource in experimenting with tools because you haven't had the right advice. Having said that, sometimes experimentation is also very important, and perhaps particularly in the initial phases as you're coming to grips with costing and pricing, you need to perhaps use a couple of different tools to get a sense of how they work, what answer they arrive at, and what's best for your organisation. What's best for your organisation will also be driven by the complexity of your organisation. Generally speaking, and this is a very general sweeping statement, the smaller the turnover of the organisation, the less complex it is. The larger the organisation, often it's more complex because it has more services that it provides, perhaps more divisions, perhaps it's geographically or otherwise segregated, but also it might have marketing or other non-client facing divisions that need to be taken into account in the costing and pricing process. That complexity to a degree drives the complexity of your costing and pricing tool, because if your organisation is relatively simple and only has 3 or 4 products, for instance, and operates only in one location or one town, one geographic area, then perhaps the costing and pricing tool should also be relatively simple. Whereas if it's a large organisation with a large turnover, probably it needs to be a more complex tool in order to ensure that your organisation understands its costing and pricing outcomes and that sustainability is able to be managed in that way. The other thing that I think is really important for organisations to think about before they look at the tool that they might want to purchase is actually working out what it is that you're actually costing and pricing. In other words, identifying what your service types are or your products are for your organisation. Again, this is well covered in the study guide, but I do think that organisations tend to perhaps not think so much about what their products are and perhaps let their products be nominated in what I would call traditional terms. That is, the kinds of products that you've traditionally been funded for instance. Of course, in relation to disability services and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, under NDIS, you of course will have the price list there in any case, which you can cost to if that is the most appropriate for your organisation. Nevertheless, you do need to identify what your products are before you can identify what costing and pricing tool is that you need. The other thing to think about is whether you can simply cost and price at an aggregate level or at an individual product or service delivery level. At an aggregate level, if you're a small organisation, it's probably possible to cost and price at the corporate level. In other words, looking at, say, a small number of products and costing those small number of products at that very high level. If you are a more complex organisation, then you might need to think about actually costing down to the individual product level, in which case it might be, for instance, that one accommodation house that you might operate might have a different price to another accommodation house because of the care needs of individuals, because of the location, or other cost impacts that you might take into consideration. I think this is a really important point to think about as well, and that is not only what do I need to cost, but also what are the potential variations of cost that we're experiencing in our organisation. So for instance, if you're an organisation that provides services in one city in Australia, then likely the cost impacts on those services, even though they might be geographically diverse, are probably going to be fairly uniform. Things like fuel, staffing costs, general operating costs, electricity, water, etc. are probably all going to be relatively uniform. On the other hand, if you're an organisation that might operate both in cities, in country, rural, regional, or even remote locations, then you might have also different costs associated with those areas that you need to take into consideration. And therefore, it's not just a size complexity or a number of services that you deliver that take into account complexity, but it might also mean that the geographical impact of cost will be something that you need to take into account as well. I guess the final point there is, do I have the right staff to undertake this process? Many organisations have long-serving and very experienced staff providing their financial support within organisations, but perhaps there needs to be some training, some external advice sought, or some other support provided to those staff so that they can enter into the, in many cases, new world of costing and pricing. Some of the specifics, I guess the first thing first, once you've answered all of the questions that I've talked about previously, is looking at the tools available. And of course, a first step might be to look at the Costing and Pricing Learning Program website, but you can see that there are many tools available for costing and pricing by simply Googling that particular term. The other thing that you can do is, of course, talk to financial accountants who might be regular supports for your organisation, board members and the like, or it might even be that you talk to your auditor or some other service provider in the finance area to find out what kinds of tools are available and to start to get a list of those tools so that you can consider those tools for your selection process. When you're selecting a tool, of course, you need to think about the specific skills needed. What kind of upskilling do you need in your organisation to be able to manage that tool to get the best out of it? What kind of costs are associated with that upskilling, as well as what kind of costs are associated with the purchase of the tool itself, of course. You need to think about the outputs from that tool to see whether they're sufficient for your needs. Are they sufficiently nuanced? Are they sufficiently specific for what you need in your organisation? On the other side of the coin, though, you might also consider whether or not that tool is too complex for your needs. A smaller organisation, as I said before, and remembering this is a very general comment, it might be that in a small organisation you need a relatively simple tool, and some of the off-the-shelf suites of costing and pricing tools might be too complex for you and represent too much of a capital investment in purchasing them, as well as a ongoing investment in terms of training and support to them. Of course, the final point that's important to think about as well is not just the use of the tool, but the time and cost of implementation. How much does it cost to purchase, and how much time does it take to implement within your organisation, including things like training time? It might also be, and it's becoming much more popular with software providers for, I think, probably obvious reasons, but you don't actually pay an upfront cost, but rather a subscription fee. And so you might find the model is going to cost you a subscription fee for the foreseeable future. The other thing that you need to think about in terms of the specifics of your selection for a costing and pricing tool is whether or not your tool needs to integrate with your financial system. So in a more complex, generally speaking, in a more complex organisation, it might be more efficient and more effective for the costing and pricing tool to integrate with your financial system. That might allow the financial data, the actual expenses and income, to be downloaded into the tool so that you can use actual data. It might also allow the tool to be, if you like, a basis for a budget, which might then upload into the financial system. And then finally, that integration with the financial system might allow you to regularly report your actual experience of costs and prices as opposed to your expected experiences, so that you can nuance, you can tweak your costing and pricing assumptions and get better focus and better outcomes in relation to your expectations of costing and pricing. Remembering always that costing and pricing is a forecasting process. It's akin to budgeting, and so getting that actual versus expected outcome report is a really important part of the governance over the costing and pricing system. I guess the other thing that really needs to be thought through too is whether or not the tool easily supports what we call what-if scenario planning. So it's one thing to cost and price your services immediately, and obviously that's a really important thing to do, but it might be too that organisations want to use their costing and pricing suite to help them to make strategic decisions or tactical decisions about what kind of services they might go into, what kind of prices they might charge, or where they might operate, what kind of things might happen if certain costs increase beyond the expected outcome, for instance. Those what-if scenarios are really important for organisations to test both how susceptible they are to sustainability issues, so what kind of increment is required in costs, for instance, to be able to really put in jeopardy the organisation's sustainability, but also to allow senior people within organisations to make decisions about where your organisation might go in relation to financial sustainability, or what impact your strategic objectives might have in terms of that sustainability. You might also look at whether or not the tool provides different reports or budgets to different people. So there could be reports, budgets, there could be costing and pricing reports that are relevant to the finance manager, that are relevant to the CEO, but equally that might be relevant to people who are running specific divisions or specific service offerings, right down to specific coalface service offerings. So those different reports and budgets available might help you to determine whether or not the tool is appropriate to you, depending on the information needs and the decision making at different levels in your organisation. Of course, one of the key questions is whether you need to access training in order to use the particular tool. And that is a very critical question for two reasons. One is because at the end of the day, of course, training costs, and you need to assess your commitment to the tool and how much resource it's going to require. But the second part of that is whether or not there's redundancy built into your staffing around this tool. In other words, you don't want just one person knowing how to operate the tool and having them win lotto so they go away and leave immediately and leave you hanging because you don't have another staff member that's able to access the tool and use it properly. So that training for immediate users is important, but more broadly, building in the redundancy is critical to your ongoing operations as well. And then, of course, what does the preferred tool cost compared to, say, other perhaps less functional tools that might be available in the marketplace, but that might represent better value for money for your organisation. In terms of other issues, there are other things that need to be thought through as well. And probably some of these things are most important when we talk about Excel spreadsheets. And as I mentioned before, Excel spreadsheets are probably one of the most commonly used tools for costing and pricing, certainly within the disability services sector, but also more broadly in commerce and in government, where Excel has come to be a very important mainstay tool in these kinds of processes. There's nothing wrong with Excel per se either. Excel can be very powerful and very useful, as well as being relatively simple and almost universally understood by people working in finance and financial management in Australia. However, there are some things around things like Excel that you need to consider. Firstly, version control. If you've got multiple users using a spreadsheet or using your tool, how do you ensure that you have version control so that everyone's working off the same version and the most up-to-date version? Indeed, where you have multiple users, how does that tool allow you to have multiple users and at the same time not corrupt the data or have version control issues? I guess the extension of that multiple users issue too is what kind of controls or authorization arrangements are put in place to ensure that the right people are able to make decisions and enter data into your costing and pricing tool. That's a very critical thing. It's not to say people might input data in any sort of expectation of doing damage to your organisation. However, the more people that are involved, then the more likely there are different interpretations, different definitions, different ideas that might be used around costing and pricing, much less the assumptions that are associated with that process. And so you need to have some controls in place to avoid the confusion and the difficulty that might accrue there. Part of that control would of course relate to quality assurance and looking at what the tool has in terms of being able to be used to quality assure the data that's in the tool. Certainly, Microsoft Excel is a little bit more difficult in terms of quality assurance. However, there are some basic things that you can use, including control checks, as well as having people go through the assumptions and looking at the quality of the data. Certainly in the earlier days of costing and pricing, it's important to have people going through the assumptions and the data to make sure that you're confident that your costing and pricing outputs are within the realms of reliability for your organisation. I guess the next really important thing to consider in terms of costing and pricing tools, probably not so much Excel, but certainly more broadly where there are off-the-shelf suites, is the IT minimum requirements. It's one thing to get access to a good costing and pricing tool, but you might have capital requirements in ensuring your current IT is able to support the use of that particular tool. And of course, if it can't, there are certainly costs associated with that. And then finally, as I mentioned before, this issue of staff redundancy, keeping the knowledge within your organisation and ensuring that more than one person is able to use the costing and pricing tool is very critical for you going forward. Again, Excel is often very attractive to organisations because of the almost universal knowledge of Excel, at least even at very general sense, that allows people to understand what is going on and to be able to perhaps pick up budget files or costing and pricing tool files and to continue with the process. Some further ideas just in relation to that. One of the things that you can do on a lot of suites that are for sale off the shelf for costing and pricing is actually use those suites and experiment with them in a limited way. That's probably a very sensible thing to do to be able to discard as quickly as possible those suites that might not be of value to your organisation and to alight on some key suites that you think might be worth part of the costing and pricing tools for your organisation. Run some cost elements through the model to test it, see what the outcomes are, see how complex it is in terms of making assumptions and putting data in, and perhaps even get an assessment or a sense of what kind of cost would be involved in training, how difficult is it to use that particular suite. One of the things that you might do is to talk to the suite provider and see whether or not there are some people who have bought the suite before and to see whether or not they will talk to you to let you know, I guess, the good and the bad about that particular costing and pricing package. You might also speak with colleagues in the sector to see how they have resolved their needs, particularly those colleagues that are in the same types of organisations as yourself or operating in the same areas, providing the same services. That level of discussion within the sector is really important because people who have been there before will be able to tell you what's good and what's bad. And remembering all of the tools have good points and bad points, so there's no perfect tool out there. And then finally you might consider external advice. What kind of advice can consultants, your auditors or others offer you in terms of what your needs might be? It might even be that you need to have someone come in and set up the service, or that to undertake the initial costing and pricing round to set up the support documents and other things that might be needed to ensure that you have a good costing and pricing experience with that tool. That concludes the comments around the costing and pricing tools and selection processes. As I said before, go back to the Costing and Pricing Learning Program, have a look at the materials there, and particularly have a look at the tools. Look more broadly to see what's around, but I guess the other aspect that needs to be considered is the fact that the longer you spend looking for tools, the more time that you invest in investigating the possibilities. Of course, there is a cost-benefit aspect to the organisation in that regard as well. You need to make sure that at the end of the day, the tools that you're looking to implement have the best cost-benefit outcome for your organisation. They cost to the right level and that they are supportable in the medium to longer term. Thank you again. I appreciate being able to talk with you, and I look forward to talking with you next time on the Costing and Pricing Learning Program.